It begins with the sound you are told not to wander, not to talk to anyone, not even to breathe too deeply near strangers. And still, the tension grew. But this story you're about to hear, it isn't just about a criminal. It's about the danger of assuming we can read people, that kindness always looks like kindness, that darkness always shows its face. Spoiler, it doesn't. Sometimes evil wears the most ordinary smile. Sometimes it blends into crowds so effortlessly that no one notices the cracks until it's far too late. And that is where our journey begins. With a city wrapped in rain, a lingering unease, and a story waiting in the shadows. A story that would change everything. As we step into this narrative, keep one thought close. Fear is not always loud. It often arrives softly, like footsteps on wet pavement, or a stranger's eyes that linger a second too long. Welcome to Rostov. Welcome to the beginning of a truth people were never prepared to face. He wasn't the kind of person you would notice in a crowd. Not the loud one, not the eccentric one, not the one who made people turn their heads when he entered a room. If anything, he was the opposite. The sort of man you would pass on the street without a second glance. A man whose presence felt like silence, like a blank page between two chapters. There was something almost unsettling about how ordinary he looked. A soft, polite tone, a posture that suggested shyness more than confidence, movements that never drew attention. He worked, he commuted, he waited in lines like everyone else. People knew him only in the vaguest sense, as that colleague who always kept to himself, or that neighbor who nodded politely but never lingered for conversation. And yet, beneath that surface, a different reality quietly pulsed. A life lived in two layers, one visible, one carefully hidden. Think about the people you run into every day, the ones whose names you don't know, whose routines you've memorized only because you've seen them so often. The man who buys bread at the same time each morning, the coworker who always chooses the far corner of the room. We build assumptions about them without realizing it. We fill in the blanks simply because it's easier than facing the unknown. That's exactly what happened here. Everyone thought they understood him because he seemed predictable, quiet, harmless. But sometimes silence isn't shyness. Sometimes it's a shield. And sometimes the quietest people carry storms inside them. He was a master of blending in, though not intentionally. It was simply who he was. His face slipped from memory as easily as it entered it. He dressed plainly, spoke softly, avoided confrontation. People described him later with the same frustrated confusion. He seemed normal. He seemed nothing. That was the problem. He wasn't remarkable enough to draw suspicion. He wasn't strange enough to worry anyone. He occupied that eerie middle ground, the type of person who could stand beside you while your instincts remained completely silent. And silence can be dangerous. But his inner world, that was a different story. Inside, things weren't quiet at all. There were fractures, old insecurities, deep-rooted fears, and a sense of inadequacy that grew like a shadow trailing his every step. He carried resentment the way others carry small daily irritations, except his never faded. It deepened, thickened, twisted. He built an image for others to see. Polite, patient, timid, invisible. A mask made of everyday gestures and predictable habits. Imagine looking at someone who seems completely average, only to learn later that their mind worked in ways no one around could have imagined. The contrast alone is chilling, not because of what he did, but because of how convincingly he hid the storm. Not through charm or manipulation, but through mediocrity, through forgettability. There's a strange discomfort in that idea, isn't there? The realization that danger doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it enters quietly, politely holding the door, offering a soft greeting, blending into routines until it becomes indistinguishable from the background. People trust what feels familiar. And he made himself familiar, a harmless silhouette in countless daily scenes. Later, when his double life finally came to light, many struggled with disbelief. They replayed old memories, searching for signs they'd missed. An odd look, a strange comment, a moment that felt off. But often, there was nothing to find. That was the disturbing truth. His disguise was not crafted. It was simply who he became after years of feeling inadequate, unnoticed, unseen. He slipped through the cracks of society because he matched them perfectly. And perhaps that's the lesson hidden in this part of the story. We don't always overlook people because we're careless. Sometimes their invisibility is their strongest armor. A shield built not from brilliance, but from emptiness. From a life so average it becomes almost eerie. This was the man no one truly saw. Not because he hid in shadows, but because he blended with the light. The investigation began like most investigations do, with confidence. With notebooks filled, maps pinned with neat red markers, and the quiet determination of people who believed the puzzle could be solved if only they looked closely enough. But very soon, that confidence began to slip. Nothing lined up. Nothing matched. Clues appeared, then dissolved into contradictions. One day the trail pointed in one direction, the next day it twisted away like smoke in the wind. Investigators found themselves staring at patterns that refused to become patterns, details that felt important but remained stubbornly disconnected. It was as if the case itself was playing tricks on them, as if someone, somewhere, understood exactly how to stay one step beyond the reach of logic. The city heard rumors, of course. They always do. Whispers in markets, hushed conversations in stairwells, worried glances exchanged between neighbors who didn't want to admit their fear out loud. Each new disappearance spread through the streets like cold wind slipping under a door. And the authorities? They were left chasing shadows. Every lead felt promising, until it didn't. Every reported sighting led nowhere. Every clue turned into a dead end. One part of the challenge was geographical. The events didn't stay contained within a single neighborhood or district. They scattered across different parts of the region, appearing unpredictably, as if intentionally avoiding any pattern the investigators could grasp. They drew lines on maps. They circled clusters. They built theories. But the theories fell apart just as quickly as they were formed. It felt like chasing a phantom, a presence that moved in silence, leaving only fragments behind. Fragments too small, too vague, too contradictory to assemble into anything solid. Imagine being one of those investigators for a moment. You sit in an office, thick with cigarette smoke and tension, staring at the same documents again and again, trying to see what you've missed. You feel the pressure building, from the public, from your superiors, from your own conscience. Every day brings the same question. Why aren't we closer? Why can't we catch him? And the answer is always the same. Because the clues don't make sense. Because the man behind all of this is not acting according to any logic they understand. Because he slips between categories, between profiles, between expectations. That's what frightened them the most. Not the severity of the case, but the unpredictability of it. Unpredictability is the enemy of control. As time passed, the detectives began to feel the weight of frustration settle on their shoulders. Morale dropped. Tension rose. The sense of failure lingered like a storm cloud in every briefing room. They questioned witnesses who contradicted each other. They collected evidence that led them in circles. They followed tips from frightened citizens, only to discover each one fizzled into nothingness. One investigator later said that the case felt like trying to assemble a puzzle using pieces from 3 different boxes. Another admitted that some nights he felt the city itself was hiding something from him, as if the truth were buried beneath layers of fog no amount of determination could lift. And all the while, outside the walls of police stations and offices, people grew more nervous. Parents held their children closer. Friends refused to walk home alone. Even the bravest began to look over their shoulders a little more often. But the worst part? The absence of answers became its own kind of terror. Humans fear many things: darkness, danger, the unknown. But nothing frightens us quite like confusion. Because confusion means vulnerability. Confusion means there's something, or someone, in your world that you cannot predict, cannot understand, cannot anticipate. And in this case, that confusion was spreading quickly, seeping into every corner of the investigation. It wasn't just that the clues didn't fit, it was the unsettling realization that maybe they never would. This chapter of the story is defined not by action, but by tension. The tight, uncomfortable tension of people trying to grasp answers that kept slipping through their fingers. Of detectives staring at walls covered in photos and pins and notes, wondering if they were missing something obvious, or if the truth was simply too well hidden. This was the moment when the case stopped being a typical investigation and became something else entirely. A labyrinth without a center, a mystery without a pattern, a chase without a direction. And the man responsible? He remained invisible, untouched, unnoticed, leaving behind only tracks that refused to add up. It's strange how often the truth speaks quietly. Not in headlines, not in official reports, but in the voices of ordinary people who feel something is wrong long before anyone is willing to admit it. And in this story, those voices were everywhere, scattered across the city like faint echoes that never quite reached the right ears. Some were whispers from neighbors who noticed unusual movements outside their buildings. Some came from commuters who remembered seeing someone act oddly on a train, but brushed it off as just another uncomfortable moment in a crowded world. And some were the trembling voices of families who felt deep in their bones that something terrible had happened to the people they loved. But back then, their warnings dissolved into the background noise of everyday life. Imagine the scene. A worried mother stands in a dimly lit station office, trying to explain that her daughter didn't come home last night, that she always comes home, that this isn't like her. But the clerk, tired and overworked, reassures her with a practiced smile. She's probably with friends. She'll show up soon. Don't worry too much. And maybe he truly believed it. Or maybe it was easier than confronting a darker possibility. Denial is its own kind of shelter. But those small reassurances, repeated day after day, started to form cracks. Because the families knew. They felt the shift. They sensed the danger long before the authorities could connect the dots. There were witnesses, too. People who noticed things that didn't sit right. A stranger lingering too long near a bus stop. A man whose gaze followed someone a little too intently. A figure walking alone late at night in a place that rarely saw anyone at that hour. Most witnesses weren't sure what they'd seen. Some convinced themselves they imagined it. Others tried to report it, only to be met with polite nods, slow paperwork, and the uneasy feeling that their words were being dismissed. One woman later recalled how she approached officers twice about a suspicious encounter she'd had on a quiet road. "They looked at me like I was overreacting," she said, "like I was letting my imagination run wild." But fear doesn't come from imagination alone. Sometimes fear is intuition, and intuition is rarely wrong. And then there were the overlooked stories, fragments of conversations overheard in stairwells, children telling parents they'd seen someone strange in the courtyard, elderly neighbors insisting that something felt off near the woods. These voices didn't blend into a coherent narrative at the time. They were separate threads, each one too thin to be taken seriously. But when you weave them together, when you listen to all of them, They create a tapestry of warnings that should never have been ignored. The tragedy wasn't just in what happened. It was in how many chances there were to notice the pattern forming. How many opportunities slipped past because no one thought those quiet voices mattered. Authorities weren't indifferent. They were overwhelmed. Cases blurred together. Information piled up faster than it could be processed. Some officers truly tried to listen, sift through the confusion, and follow every lead. But the system was strained, stretched thin, and not designed for something so unusual, so unpredictable, so deeply unsettling. The result was a gap, a silent space where warnings fell through, unnoticed. And in that silence, fear grew. People felt it even when they couldn't explain it. A shiver walking past a certain alley, a sudden urge to cross the street, an inexplicable tension in places that used to feel safe. Human instincts are sharper than we give them credit for, but instincts only matter when someone listens. Looking back, many witnesses carried guilt. If I had insisted, if I had been louder, if I hadn't let them dismiss me. But none of this was their fault. They were speaking into a storm no one yet understood, a storm growing faster than anyone realized. And perhaps the most haunting part of this chapter is not the fear itself, but the idea that countless people were trying, in their own small ways, to warn the world. To say, something is wrong here. To say, please pay attention. Their voices were soft, fragile, human. Too human for a system that needed certainty before it could act. These were the voices no one listened to. The voices that, had they been heard, might have changed everything. When people try to understand someone capable of causing so much fear, they often look for dramatic clues. Wild eyes, sudden outbursts, a history written in bold warning signs. But sometimes the darkness begins quietly, almost invisibly, like a shadow forming at the edge of a room. This is not a portrait of a monster in the traditional sense. It's the portrait of a deeply broken mind, one shaped by years of emotional disconnection, insecurity, and an inner turmoil that grew unchecked until it twisted into something dangerous. Understanding this is uncomfortable, but necessary. Those who knew him as a child often described someone fragile, anxious, perpetually uncertain of his place in the world. Where others built confidence, he built walls. Where others learned resilience, he learned retreat. And slowly, layer by layer, he constructed a worldview where he felt inferior to everyone around him. A person who feels powerless for too long may eventually try to reclaim power in distorted ways. This doesn't excuse anything. It only explains the path. A path paved not with dramatic events, but with subtle fractures. And fractures, when ignored, deepen. And as he grew older, these insecurities hardened. He became hyper-aware of how others perceived him, or rather, how he thought they perceived him. Every social misstep, every awkward moment, every sense of rejection fed into an internal narrative that he was somehow fundamentally flawed. He withdrew deeper into himself, carrying resentment like a hidden weight. It's a dangerous mix. Profound loneliness paired with the inability to express emotion, paired with a craving for control. These ingredients, left unattended, can ferment into something far more destructive. There was also an element of duality in his personality, a split between the self he showed the world and the self he fought to hide. The external version was quiet, polite, almost timid. The internal version was chaotic, dissatisfied, constantly searching for something to fill the void he didn't know how to name. People who studied the case later said he lacked empathy, not in a dramatic, cinematic sense, but in a subtle, chilling one. He struggled to understand emotions that didn't directly revolve around his own needs or fears. And when empathy is missing, The line between right and wrong becomes disturbingly thin. But even then, he knew how to imitate normalcy. That's what made him so difficult to detect. He learned it the same way a child learns to mimic adults, by watching, copying, repeating, without understanding, without feeling. One of the most unsettling parts of his psychological profile is how ordinary some traits seemed on the surface. A tendency to avoid confrontation, a discomfort with social intimacy, a habit of withdrawing when stressed. These traits exist in countless people who live peaceful, harmless lives. But in his case, they combined with deep emotional dysfunction, a storm behind a calm expression, a dangerous storm made of unprocessed traumas, unresolved fears, and a desperate hunger for significance. He wanted to matter in some way. He wanted to feel in control. And when someone craves those things but lacks healthy outlets, their thoughts can drift into darker territories. Experts later pointed out that he seemed detached from his own actions, as if he viewed the world from behind a thick pane of glass. People weren't people to him. They were symbols in a distorted narrative he created to justify his internal chaos. This detachment made him unpredictable, made him dangerous. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of his psychological portrait is his ordinariness. There was no dramatic transformation, no cinematic moment where everything snapped. His darkness unfolded slowly, gradually, like a quiet fog spreading across the landscape of his mind. And that is far more terrifying than any monster from fiction. Because it means evil doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it grows silently, nourished by neglect, fear, and secrecy. This segment isn't meant to inspire sympathy, but understanding. Understanding how someone could drift so far from humanity without anyone noticing. Understanding how the cracks in a person's psyche, if left unattended, can widen into canyons. And perhaps most importantly, understanding that danger often hides not in extremes, but in the gray spaces. In the quiet individuals who move through the world unnoticed, unfelt, unseen. This is the psychological portrait of the man behind the terror. Not a creature of dramatic evil, but a person whose inner world collapsed long before anyone realized it. There comes a moment in every investigation when the silence breaks, not with answers, but with the first hint that the fog might finally be thinning. For months, the detectives felt like they were reaching into darkness, grabbing at shadows that slipped effortlessly between their fingers. But then, something shifted. Not a breakthrough, not a confession, just movement. A sense that the invisible figure they'd been chasing had accidentally left a trace, faint, delicate, but real. And suddenly, the game began. At first, the clues seemed almost insignificant. A witness describing a man whose behavior felt off. A repeated pattern in train schedules. A cluster of locations that finally suggested a loose rhythm. Individually, these details were flimsy, but together, they created the first fragile thread of possibility. The detectives finally had something. Not certainty, but direction. And direction is power. What followed was a slow, methodical pursuit. Long nights spent reviewing routes. Endless discussions in cramped offices with maps laid out across the walls. The sound of tired voices arguing over details too murky to be trusted. The team began to watch the city more closely. They took note of lone figures at bus stops. They monitored train platforms during late hours. They observed the patterns of someone who moved quietly through public spaces, blending in almost too well. One investigator later described it as watching a ghost who didn't know he was visible. The man they were tracking didn't realize the circle was slowly tightening. Not enough to catch him, not yet, but enough to make the detectives feel something they hadn't felt in months. Momentum. Imagine the tension of those nights. You're sitting in an unmarked car, engine off, windows cracked, breath fogging faintly in the cold. Every shape on the sidewalk becomes a clue. Every passing shadow feels like it might hold the answer you've been desperate to find. You're alert, hyper alert, waiting for the smallest flicker of movement to tell you where to go next. The city feels alive in a different way. Not comforting, not peaceful, but electric. As if every streetlight, every echo of footsteps, every rustle of wind is whispering, "You're close." But how close? No one knew. Hope and dread began to walk hand in hand. On the one hand, there was the thrill of progress. On the other, the chilling realization that the man they were hunting was still active, still out there somewhere, slipping between alleys and train cars like a shadow learning to dodge the light. The detectives weren't the only ones who felt the shift. People noticed the heavier police presence, the unmarked cars parked just a little too neatly, the officers who walked the streets with eyes sharp and scanning. Rumors began to swirl again, but this time there was a feeling underneath them. A quiet hope that maybe the invisible threat was finally being cornered. But hope is fragile. And the man they pursued was unpredictable. He changed routines without warning. He appeared in new places, then vanished again. Every time the investigators thought they understood his rhythm, he broke it. It was as if he could sense the walls closing in, and pushed back by becoming even more elusive. The pursuit turned into a psychological duel. Not a battle of strength, but of nerves. Each side waiting for the other to make a mistake. Each side trying to anticipate movements that made no logical sense. And through it all, the clock kept ticking. There were nights when the team thought they had him, moments where they felt the chase tightening, where adrenaline surged as they followed a trail that seemed too perfect to be coincidence. And then, just as quickly, nothing. Silence. Another shadow leading nowhere. But even those failures taught them something. He wasn't invincible. He was just cautious, obsessively cautious. And that meant he could slip, eventually. Every near catch revealed another piece of his behavior, another fragment of his psychology, another glimpse into the mind they were trying so desperately to decode. And the investigators began to understand that catching him would mean more than simply finding the right place at the right time. They needed to think like him, move like him, predict a man whose unpredictability had become his greatest defense. It was mental chess played in the dark, and every wrong move carried consequences they could feel but not yet see. This was more than an investigation now. It was a pursuit shaped by instinct, strategy, and sheer determination. And though the detectives didn't know it yet, the game was approaching its turning point. The moment when the invisible would finally step into the light, and the cat-and-mouse chase would change forever. There is a point in every long pursuit when the air itself changes, when instinct whispers that something is about to break. For the investigators, that moment came quietly. No dramatic chase, no blaring sirens, just a subtle shift, like the city holding its breath. They didn't know it yet, but the man they'd been chasing for so long was finally about to step into their line of sight. It happened on an ordinary day, one of those gray afternoons when the clouds hang low and time feels stuck. Officers were positioned around the area, watching familiar routes, tracking his usual patterns. Patterns he didn't realize had finally revealed themselves. And then, there he was. Not disguised, not hiding, just walking, calmly, quietly, through a public space like any other citizen. The simplicity of it made the moment even more surreal. One officer noticed him first. A second confirmed. A third stepped forward, heart pounding, trying to trust his own eyes. For months, the suspect had been a phantom. Blurry descriptions, contradictory reports, shadows slipping between shadows. Now, he was standing in the open. A real person. A living figure who looked, somehow, even more ordinary than the investigators expected. The officers approached with measured steps, cautious, focused, the weight of the entire investigation pressing on their shoulders. This wasn't the moment for rash decisions. It was the moment for precision, calmness, and absolute control. "Sir, we need to speak with you," one of them said. A simple sentence, a simple request. But it carried the force of everything that had led to this point. The fear, the frustration, the unanswered questions, the sleepless nights. He turned slowly, with a mild expression, almost confused. Not panicked, not angry, just blank. And that blankness was unsettling. It was like looking into a face that had forgotten how to register normal emotion. The officers moved in closer, forming a careful semicircle around him. People nearby watched with quiet curiosity, unaware of the significance of the scene unfolding in front of them. To them, it looked like a routine check. To the investigators, it was the culmination of everything they had fought to piece together. As they escorted him away, he didn't resist. No struggle, no raised voice, no attempt to flee. Just a strange, detached compliance. The behavior of someone who seemed oddly disconnected from the reality closing in around him. One detective later said, "It felt like he'd been waiting for this moment, like a chapter he knew had to end." But the real confrontation didn't begin until they entered the interrogation room. Picture it. A small, dim room with a single table, 2 chairs, and an oppressive quiet that seems to grow heavier with every passing second. He sat there, hands still, eyes wandering as if studying the walls instead of the people in front of him. The investigators watched him closely, trying to read any flicker of emotion, any sign of tension. But there was almost nothing. Just a calmness that didn't feel like peace, more like emptiness. A trained psychologist later described it as the quiet of someone who lived too long inside their own mind. The questioning began slowly. Not accusations, not pressure, just simple, direct inquiries. The goal wasn't to force a confession, it was to understand the person sitting across from them. What motivated him? What shaped him? What he thought he was doing all those years? At first, he answered sparingly, almost reluctantly. Short phrases, quiet tones, as if words were a burden. But as the investigators pressed gently, patiently, something began to shift in the room. His tone changed. His gaze sharpened. Fragments of honesty slipped through the cracks. It was the moment when the mask, the ordinary, forgettable mask he'd worn for so long, began to fall away. The detectives exchanged glances. They could sense it, that this was the turning point, the moment the invisible would finally become visible. Piece by piece, he began to reveal the distorted logic of his actions, the twisted beliefs he clung to, the emotional void he had never filled. His words didn't come with regret, nor with pride, just a cold, unsettling clarity. A clarity that made the investigator's skin crawl, not because of violence, but because of how deeply detached he seemed from the world. It was like listening to someone describe events that happened in a dream, distant, unreal, disconnected. By the end of the session, the detectives felt a mix of conflicting emotions. Relief that the hunt was finally over. Shock at how profoundly different the truth was from anything they had imagined. And an eerie sadness, a quiet acknowledgement of how broken a human being can become when no one notices the early fractures. The moment of truth had come. Not with a dramatic outburst, but with a quiet unraveling. And in that silence, the investigators finally saw him. Not the phantom, not the shadow, but the real man behind the fear. A man whose arrest would finally lift the fog that had suffocated the city for so long. A man whose presence in that small interrogation room signaled an end and a beginning. The end of a long investigation never arrives with fireworks. It comes quietly, a soft exhale, a weight shifting, a silence settling over the rooms that once buzzed with tension. When the suspect was finally in custody, something changed in the city. It wasn't celebration, not exactly. More like a cautious breath, as if everyone had been holding it for far too long. The darkness hadn't vanished, but it had finally been named. For the investigators, the final stage wasn't triumph. It was paperwork, statements, long hours reviewing evidence they'd already memorized. But beneath all of that was an emotion they hadn't fully processed yet. Relief that the shadow they'd been chasing was no longer slipping through their fingers. In the interrogation room, the man remained calm, detached, almost eerily cooperative, as if he understood that the chase was over and there was nothing left to resist. But the truth was something different, a truth the psychologists who interviewed him would later describe as profound emotional absence. He didn't seem frightened or angry or even resigned, just empty. And that emptiness was its own kind of chilling. Outside, life slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. People walked the streets with less hesitation. Parents allowed their children to play a little farther from sight. The news reported the arrest, though the details remained carefully controlled. Most citizens never knew the full psychological complexity behind the man's actions, the confusing blend of loneliness, distorted thinking, and emotional detachment that had shaped his path. And maybe that was for the best. Some darkness doesn't need to be fully understood to be left behind. But the detectives, they understood more than they wished they did. They'd spent months living in the echo of this man's decisions. They knew how fragile human behavior could be, how small cracks in someone's psyche, left unnoticed, can widen into dangerous fractures. It changed them, subtly, but permanently. One investigator later admitted, "After a case like this, you start seeing people differently, not as threats, but as mysteries." And he wasn't wrong. The aftermath brought mandatory psychological evaluations for the officers. Long conversations in quiet offices with soft lighting, where therapists asked gentle questions like, "How are you sleeping? Do you feel on edge? What stays with you the most?" Some answered easily. Some avoided the questions. Some discovered they were carrying more tension than they realized. Because chasing a shadow for so long leaves marks. Not visible ones, but internal shifts that don't fade overnight. Even victory has its cost. Months later, after the trial concluded and the man was sentenced, the lead investigator revisited one of the original crime scenes. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted closure. He stood there quietly, hands in his pockets, watching the world move around him. Children laughing, people walking dogs, the distant sound of a train rumbling by. Normal life. Beautiful, mundane normality. It struck him how surreal it felt that a place so ordinary had once been shrouded in fear. How the same streets that now echoed with harmless noise were once under the shadow of an unseen threat. Life had resumed its rhythm. The darkness had loosened its grip, and the city, without even noticing, had begun to heal. He took a breath, a deep, grounding breath, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel heavy. As he walked away, he thought about the man they'd caught. Not with hatred, not with satisfaction, but with a strange sense of human reflection. A recognition that monsters aren't born from nothing. They come from fractures, from forgotten places in the human mind, from roads no one chose to walk with them. And that understanding, as unsettling as it was, gave him something unexpected. Compassion. Not for what the man had done, but for the brokenness that had shaped him long before the investigation ever began. In the end, the story wasn't just about catching someone dangerous. It was about seeing clearly what fear had hidden, and finding the courage to look at the humanity buried beneath the darkness. Because even the darkest chapters end. Even the most haunting shadows eventually fade. And when the light finally returns, we remember that the world, despite everything, keeps moving forward. The case was closed. But its lessons about vigilance, about empathy, about the fragile balance inside the human mind would stay with the investigators for years to come. After the darkness, there is always a chance for light.